"I will disinherit you, damn you," said the millionaire to his son upon learning that he was going to marry a humble farmer. What his son did left everyone speechless. The grand Sterling mansion, perched high on Ash Hollow's most exclusive hill, was buzzing with its usual air of opulence. Sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows, casting gleams on the polished marble floors. Everything about the place screamed perfection, except for the storm brewing in the heart of its patriarch, William Sterling. William sat in his leather armchair, his sharp gaze locked on his son, Benjamin, who stood before him, visibly uneasy but resolute. The silence was suffocating. "So," William finally spoke, his voice icy and calculated. "You're serious about this, Grace?" "Yes, father," Benjamin replied, meeting his father's glare with equal intensity. "We're in love, and we're getting married." The words hung in the air like an explosion, echoing off the walls. William's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, his presence towering despite sitting down. "Do you have any idea what this means for the family? For our name, for the empire I've built for you?" Benjamin clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "I know exactly what it means. It means I'll be with someone who truly loves me. Not for my money, not for my name, but for who I am. Isn't that worth more than anything else?" William's laugh was cold, almost mocking. Love doesn't pay the bills, son. Love doesn't maintain alliances or keep Sterling Industries at the top. This marriage will destroy everything I've worked for." Benjamin's face hardened. "If you see it that way, then so be it." That was the breaking point. William stood abruptly, slamming his fist on the desk. "If you marry that girl, you'll be cut off, disowned, no trust fund, no shares, no support. Do you understand?" Benjamin's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve didn't waver. "I understand, father, and I'll still choose her. I'd rather live a modest life with Grace than inherit a fortune at the cost of my soul." Before William could respond, Benjamin turned on his heel and walked out of the office, leaving his father in a simmering rage. The door's heavy thud echoed through the house, signaling a storm none of the staff dared to comment on. In a small, quaint village on the outskirts of Ash Hollow, Grace was tending to her grandmother's modest garden. The sun warmed her face as she plucked ripe tomatoes, her mind wandering to the conversation Benjamin was likely having with his father. She had never sought wealth or status. Her heart was content in the simple life she had always known. But now, her love for Benjamin had placed her in the center of a whirlwind far beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Her grandmother, a wise woman with a weathered face and kind eyes, called out from the porch, "Grace, dear, come inside for a moment." Setting down her basket, Grace made her way to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her grandmother gestured for her to sit. "I know you're worried about Benjamin," she began gently. "But remember, love isn't about easy paths. It's about standing firm together, even when the road gets tough." Grace nodded, her chest tightening. "I just hope he's okay." Meanwhile, in the confines of his bedroom, Benjamin sat on the edge of his bed, staring out at the sprawling estate that now felt more like a gilded cage. He pulled out his phone and dialed Grace's number. Her voice, soft and familiar, brought him a sense of calm. "How did it go?" she asked hesitantly. He sighed. "As expected, he's furious, but Grace, I don't care about the money or the name. I care about you, and I won't let him or anyone else come between us." Her heart swelled with both love and worry. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me, Ben. You're not making me lose anything. You're giving me everything," he replied firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Unbeknownst to the couple, William was already hatching a plan. He wasn't the kind of man to let things spiral out of his control, especially not when his family name and fortune were at stake. If Benjamin was too stubborn to listen, William decided, then Grace would have to be the one to back down. He reached for his phone and made a call. "Arrange a meeting with her," he ordered curtly. "I'll make her understand why this relationship is impossible." His secretary hesitated on the other end. "And if she doesn't, sir?" William's lips curled into a grim smile. "She will. Everyone has their price." As the sun set over Ash Hollow, two hearts remained steadfast in their love, unaware of the storm about to engulf them. The Sterling mansion loomed like a fortress as Grace arrived. Clutching her purse tightly, the taxi ride to Ash Hollow's wealthiest estate had been nerve-wracking enough. But now, Standing in the shadow of its grandeur, she felt her heart hammering in her chest. The invitation, or rather, the summons, from William Sterling had been abrupt, leaving her with little time to prepare. The butler greeted her with polite indifference, his expression revealing nothing. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in the study. This way, please." As she followed him through the gleaming corridors, Grace couldn't help but feel out of place. Her modest dress and scuffed shoes seemed to mock the opulence around her. Chandeliers sparkled like constellations above polished floors, and portraits of long-dead Sterlings lined the walls, their eyes seeming to judge her. When the butler opened the door to the study, William Sterling was already seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his presence as commanding as the room itself. He didn't rise to greet her, but gestured to the chair across from him. "Grace," he said evenly, his voice betraying none of the fury Benjamin had described. "Thank you for coming." Grace forced a small smile and sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Mr. Sterling, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I appreciate the invitation." William studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries. You know why you're here." She met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I can imagine." "Then let me be direct." He leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "My son has made a foolish decision, one that jeopardizes not only his future, but the Sterling name itself. You may think you love him, but love doesn't build empires. It doesn't ensure stability or legacy." Grace took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling, Benjamin and I aren't trying to build empires. We're trying to build a life together." William's expression didn't change. "A life built on what? Sentiment? You don't belong in our world, Grace. You lack the refinement, the connections, the understanding of what it means to bear the Sterling name." Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she refused to let him see her crumble. "I may not come from wealth, Mr. Sterling, but I know what matters. Love, respect, integrity. Those things mean more to me than money ever could." "Integrity," he repeated, a sharp edge in his voice. "Tell me, Grace, is it integrity that drives you to marry into a fortune? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like opportunism." The accusation hit hard, but Grace held her ground. "I didn't choose Benjamin for his money. I chose him for the man he is. And if you took the time to see him beyond your expectations, maybe you'd understand why." William's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed facade. "You have no idea what it takes to survive in this world. Neither did my father," she said suddenly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But he tried." William's brow furrowed. "Your father." Grace swallowed hard, the memories flooding back. "My father, Robert. He once worked with you, didn't he? He spoke of you often when I was a child. How you were partners. How you started Sterling Industries together." William's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Robert?" "Yes," she said, her voice steadier now. "Robert Hayes, my father. The man you cut out of your business when you didn't need him anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them both. William leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I haven't heard that name in years." "I'm not surprised," Grace replied. "He died not long after you parted ways. My grandmother says he never recovered from what you did to him." William's face darkened, his carefully constructed composure slipping. "That's not possible, Robert and I." "You betrayed him," Grace interrupted, her voice firm. "And now you're trying to do the same to me." The accusation hung in the air, and for the first time, William Sterling seemed at a loss for words. He stood abruptly, turning to the window as if seeking answers in the manicured garden below. "I didn't call you here to talk about the past," he said finally, his voice low. "But if you think this changes anything, you're wrong." Grace rose from her chair, her heart pounding. "I didn't come here to beg for your approval. Mr. Sterling, I came because Benjamin asked me to respect you, even if you refuse to respect me. But let me be clear. Nothing you say or do will make me walk away from him." Her words seemed to hit their mark. William turned back to face her, his expression a mix of anger and something else she couldn't quite place. Perhaps guilt. "This conversation isn't over," he said finally. "No," Grace agreed, her voice steady. "But I've said what I needed to say." She walked out of the study, her head held high, leaving William alone with his thoughts and the ghosts of a past he had long tried to forget. The Sterling mansion was unusually quiet after Grace's departure, yet the echoes of her words reverberated in William's mind. Alone in his study, he stared at the fading sunlight filtering through the curtains, his hand gripping the edge of his desk. The name Robert Hayes lingered like a ghost from his past, stirring memories he had long buried, determined to unravel the truth. William picked up his phone and dialed his private investigator, a man who had been discreetly handling his affairs for years. "I need a full background check on Grace Hayes," he ordered curtly. "And I want everything about her father, Robert Hayes. Leave nothing out." "Yes, sir," came the efficient reply. "I'll have a report ready within 48 hours. As the call ended, William leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. Part of him hoped Grace's claims were exaggerated, perhaps a tactic to sway Benjamin's affection. Yet, another part feared she was right, that he had wronged her father in ways he couldn't even remember. Meanwhile, Benjamin arrived at Grace's cottage, his heart pounding. He had waited impatiently for her to return, pacing the small porch under the watchful eyes of her grandmother. When Grace stepped out of the taxi, Benjamin was at her side in an instant. "Are you okay?" he asked. Concern etched across his face. "What did he say to you?" Grace hesitated, glancing at her grandmother, who gave her an encouraging nod before retreating into the house. "He didn't hold back," she admitted. "He thinks I'm after your money, Ben, but there's more." "What do you mean?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Grace took a deep breath, recounting the confrontation in detail, the accusations, her father's name, and William's reaction. "I told him about my dad, Benjamin, about what happened between them. I don't know if he believed me, but I could see it unsettled him." Benjamin's jaw tightened as he processed her words. "He's never talked about your father. Not once. But if what you're saying is true, then he's been hiding something," Grace finished. "And now he's looking for a way to discredit me. I'm sure of it." Benjamin placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying. "Let him investigate. He won't find anything because you've done nothing wrong. Whatever happened in the past, we'll face it together." Grace managed a faint smile, grateful for his unwavering support. "I just don't want you to lose your family because of me." "You're not the reason, Grace," he assured her. "My father and I have been on opposite sides for years. This is the final straw." At the Sterling estate, William's investigator worked through the night. Documents were unearthed, contracts examined, and old financial records scrutinized. The deeper he dug, the more he began to piece together a story that painted William Sterling in a less than favorable light. By the next evening, William sat in his study with the report in hand. As he flipped through the pages, his expression grew darker. Grace had been telling the truth. Her father, Robert Hayes, had been his partner in the early days of Sterling Industries. The two had shared ideas, dreams, and ambitions, until a deal went sour. The details were hazy, but the records clearly showed that William had maneuvered to push Robert out of the company, taking full control and leaving his former partner with nothing. William closed the file, a rare pang of guilt twisting in his chest. He had convinced himself over the years that his actions were justified, that survival in business required ruthlessness. But now, seeing the consequences through Grace's eyes, it felt different. He wondered how much of his fortune was built on the foundation of another man's ruin. Later that evening, Benjamin returned home to find his father waiting for him in the grand dining room. The tension was palpable, the silence between them heavier than ever. "I had Grace investigated," William began without preamble, his voice as cold as the crystal chandeliers above them. Benjamin's hands clenched at his sides. "Of course you did. And what did you find? That she's honest, that she's better than you ever gave her credit for." "I found the truth about her father," William admitted, his tone softer than expected. "Robert Hayes. I didn't recognize the name at first, but it's all here." He slid the folder across the table, but Benjamin didn't pick it up. Instead, he crossed his arms and met his father's gaze head-on. "And, do you feel any remorse for what you did to him, for what you've done to her?" William exhaled sharply, frustration and guilt battling within him. "I did what I had to do to build this family's legacy. I didn't see it as betrayal at the time, it was business." Benjamin shook his head, his disappointment evident. And that's the problem. You've always valued business over people, over family. Benjamin, listen, William tried, his voice strained. I'm not saying I'm proud of everything I've done, but you have to understand. No, Benjamin cut him off. What I understand is that you're still trying to justify your mistakes instead of owning them. Grace deserves better than this, and so did her father. He turned to leave, but William's voice stopped him. I'm not finished with this, Benjamin. Not by a long shot. Benjamin didn't look back. Neither am I. As the door closed behind him, William was left alone once again, staring at the evidence of his past misdeeds. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could carry it. The next morning brought a gray sky over Ash Hollow, matching the somber mood within the Sterling mansion. William sat at his desk, the open file on Robert Hayes in front of him. Despite his sleepless night, he hadn't made any progress in reconciling the weight of his past with the reality of the present. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was his investigator again. Mr. Sterling, the man began, his voice cautious. I've found additional information about Robert Hayes that you might want to review. It's personal. Go on, William said, his tone sharp. The investigator hesitated before continuing. Mr. Hayes didn't just lose his partnership with you. He was deeply in debt after the fallout. His wife fell ill shortly afterward, and the financial strain was too much. It appears he lost everything. His home, his assets, his stability. William clenched his jaw, the words cutting deeper than he expected. And Grace, was she already born then? She was very young, the investigator replied. Her mother passed away when Grace was a child, and she was raised by her grandmother after Robert died. It's likely that Grace doesn't remember much of it. Understood, William said curtly. Send me everything, as he ended the call. William's hands trembled slightly. The image of Grace, standing resolute in his study the day before, replayed in his mind. Her calm defiance, her unwavering love for Benjamin. It all reminded him of someone he had once known, Robert Hayes himself. Meanwhile, Grace was tending to the chickens in her grandmother's backyard when Benjamin arrived. A determined look on his face, he hopped out of his car and strode over to her, his hair still damp from the morning mist. Ben, she greeted, surprised but happy to see him. What brings you here so early? We need to talk, he said, his voice steady but serious. Her smile faded as she noticed the tension in his posture. What's wrong? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck before speaking. My father told me he investigated your family. He found records about your dad and their history together, Grace. He knows everything. Grace paused, the basket in her hands growing heavier. And what did he say? Benjamin sighed. He's not denying it. He admitted that he pushed your father out of the company, but knowing him, I doubt he feels as guilty as he should. Grace set the basket down and crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. He's had years to forget about us, Ben. My dad was just a stepping stone to him. Why would he feel guilty now? Because he's not as cold as he pretends to be, Benjamin said softly. I know it doesn't excuse what he did, but I can tell this is getting to him. It's in his eyes, the way he speaks. He's shaken, Grace sighed, her gaze softening. I'm not looking for his guilt or his pity. I just want him to respect us, for our love, for who we are. That's all. And I think he might be starting to, Benjamin said, stepping closer to her. But it's not going to happen overnight. Are you ready for that? She nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. I've been ready since the day I met you, back at the Sterling mansion. William made his way to the family archives, a grand hidden room filled with decades of company records, personal letters, and memorabilia. He rarely ventured there, but today, something compelled him to search for the remnants of his partnership with Robert Hayes. After hours of sifting through dusty folders and faded documents, he found what he was looking for, an old photograph of him and Robert standing outside the company's first office. The two young men in the picture were a stark contrast to the hardened man William had become. Next to it was a letter written by Robert, one that William hadn't seen in years. The letter was brief but piercing. William, I trusted you, not just with the business but with my family's future. You didn't just take the company from me. You took everything, I hope, for your sake. It was worth it. William sat heavily in the chair, the weight of the letter settling over him like a shroud. He had always justified his actions as necessary, even unavoidable, but now, for the first time, he wondered if the price had been too high. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Benjamin returned home to find his father waiting in the sitting room. William looked older, wearier than Benjamin had ever seen him. In his hands was the photograph of him and Robert, along with the letter. "I need to speak with you," William said, his voice quieter than usual. Benjamin hesitated but sat down across from him. "What is it now?" William held up the photograph. "This was me and Robert. The day we opened Sterling Industries, we were supposed to build something together. Something great. And instead, you took it all for yourself," Benjamin replied bluntly. William winced but nodded. "Yes, and I paid for it in ways I didn't understand until now." Benjamin leaned forward, his tone edged with skepticism. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand," William said, his voice steady despite the crack in his composure. "What I did to Robert, what I've done to Grace, it's not just about business. It's about the kind of man I've become, and I don't like what I see." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Benjamin stood, his expression softening ever so slightly. "If you really mean that, then prove it. Respect Grace. Respect us." William nodded, the weight of his son's words sinking in. "I'll try." As Benjamin left the room, William remained seated, staring at the photograph of his younger self and the friend he had betrayed. For the first time in years, he began to question whether the legacy he had built was worth the cost. The Sterling family name carried weight, too much weight, as Benjamin and Grace were quickly realizing. News of their engagement spread like wildfire through Ash Hollow's elite circles. Gossip seeped into every corner of high society, carried by whispers at dinner parties, murmurs in luxury boutiques, and speculative headlines in local tabloids. "Sterling heir chooses love over legacy" was splashed across one glossy magazine, accompanied by a less than flattering photo of Grace taken without her knowledge. Beneath it, the article speculated about her background, mocking her modest upbringing and framing her as a gold digger. Benjamin crumpled the magazine in his hands when he found it on a coffee table at the country club. "She's not after my money," Benjamin snapped at one of his old acquaintances who dared to joke about the headline. "She has more integrity in her little finger than half of you combined." The room fell silent, and Benjamin stormed out, ignoring the stares that followed him. He had long grown tired of the empty conversations and pretentiousness of his peers, but now, their judgment of Grace made it unbearable. Back at the cottage, Grace was also feeling the weight of scrutiny. Her grandmother, normally calm and collected, was unusually tense as they sat down for tea. "People in town are talking," her grandmother said softly, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "They're saying things about you, about Benjamin." Grace sighed, pushing her cup aside. "I know. I hear the whispers when I go to the market. They think I'm not good enough for him." Her grandmother reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Grace's. "You've faced worse, child. Don't let their words define you. You know who you are. And so does Benjamin." Grace nodded, but the sting of those words lingered. She had always known their love would face challenges, but she hadn't expected the entire town to turn into a jury, questioning her worth at every turn. At the Sterling mansion, William was also feeling the pressure, though he masked it well. The board members of Sterling Industries, many of whom were close family friends, had started voicing their concerns about Benjamin's judgment during a routine meeting. One of them, an older man named Gregory Monroe, finally addressed the elephant in the room. "William," Gregory began, his tone polite but firm, "about Benjamin's engagement. You must realize how this will reflect on the company." William raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Go on?" Gregory cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Sterling Industries has always been synonymous with prestige and excellence. Associating with someone of questionable background could undermine that image." The room murmured in agreement, and William's gaze turned cold. "Are you suggesting that my son's personal life is a threat to our business?" "I'm suggesting," Gregory replied carefully, "that you consider the broader implications, perhaps. Encourage Benjamin to reconsider." William's lips tightened into a thin line. For years, he had controlled every aspect of his family's image, ensuring their name remained untouchable. But now, even he was beginning to question if the cost of protecting that image was too high. "This is a family matter," William said finally, his voice firm. "And it will be dealt with as such now, unless anyone has pressing business to discuss. This meeting is over." The tension in the room was palpable as the board members filed out, leaving William alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he found himself defending Grace, not out of affection, but out of frustration with the narrow-mindedness of his peers. That evening, Benjamin and Grace met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, hoping to find some solace away from prying eyes. As they sipped their drinks, Benjamin reached for Grace's hand across the table. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, "for everything you're going through because of me." "It's not your fault," she replied, though the weariness in her voice betrayed her. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." Benjamin squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "I don't care what they say. You're the only person I've ever been sure about. If I have to leave all of this behind to be with you, I will." Grace shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You don't have to leave anything behind, Ben. We can make this work. Together." Their moment of quiet resolve was interrupted when Benjamin's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "It's my father." "Go ahead," Grace urged. "Take it." He hesitated before answering. "What is it?" "Benjamin." William's voice came through, uncharacteristically subdued. "We need to talk. About Grace. About everything." Benjamin's stomach tightened. "If this is about trying to make me change my mind..." "It's not," William interrupted. "Just come by tomorrow. There are things you need to hear." Benjamin ended the call and looked back at Grace, his expression unreadable. "He wants to talk. I don't know what that means, but I'll go." Grace nodded, her own apprehension mirrored in his eyes. "Whatever happens, just remember why we're doing this." Benjamin leaned across the table and kissed her hand. "I'll never forget." As the night settled over Ash Hollow, the tensions between love and legacy, wealth and worth, began to strain even further. For William, the decision loomed larger than ever: continue guarding his empire's image at all costs, or finally face the consequences of his past and accept Grace as part of the family. For Benjamin and Grace, the road ahead seemed steeper, but their determination to walk it together only grew stronger. The storm was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next. The morning sun peeked through the Sterling Mansion's towering windows, but the warmth it brought didn't reach the cold. Heavy atmosphere inside. Benjamin strode into the study, his footsteps firm, but his heart wary. His father was already there, sitting at the massive desk with an old photograph in his hand. The sight of the picture gave Benjamin pause. It was of William and another man, standing outside a modest building that bore the early logo of Sterling Industries. "Robert Hayes," William said, gesturing to the man beside him in the photo. "That's Grace's father." Benjamin remained silent, his jaw tightening. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And..." William placed the photograph on the desk and sighed. "I was wrong about her, about a lot of things." That caught Benjamin off guard. He had prepared himself for another confrontation, not for this. "What are you saying, Dad?" "I'm saying," William began, his voice quieter now, "that Grace isn't who I thought she was. She's not trying to exploit you. If anything, she's trying to protect her family's name, what little I left of it." Benjamin pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. "And what brought you to that conclusion? Guilt? Or did someone finally call you out on what you did?" William flinched but didn't look away. "Both," he admitted. "I've spent years justifying my actions, telling myself it was just business, but seeing Grace, hearing her talk about her father, it made me realize how much I took from him." "From them?" Benjamin studied his father, searching for signs of sincerity. For the first time in years, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in William's eyes. It was enough to soften his stance, though not entirely. "So, what now?" Benjamin asked. "Do you expect me to forgive you just like that?" "No," William replied, shaking his head. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make it right. For Grace, for you, and for Robert's memory." Benjamin's brow furrowed. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" William hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. I've been considering making a charitable contribution in Robert's name, something to honor his legacy. Stop, Benjamin interrupted, his voice firm. If you think throwing money at this will fix everything, you haven't learned a thing. William's hand froze mid-motion. Then what do you suggest? Benjamin exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. If you really want to honor Robert's legacy, then start with Grace. Respect her. Accept her as part of this family, not as an obligation or a way to ease your guilt, but because she's the best thing that's ever happened to me. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Benjamin wondered if his father would argue, but William simply nodded, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him. I'll try, William said at last. For you? Meanwhile, at the Hayes cottage, Grace was spending the morning in the garden with her grandmother. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly turned soil. Grace worked in silence, but her thoughts were far from peaceful. Her grandmother, always perceptive, finally broke the silence. Something's troubling you. Grace looked up, startled. What makes you say that? You've pulled weeds from the same spot 3 times, her grandmother replied with a knowing smile. What's on your mind, child? Grace set down her trowel and wiped her hands on her apron. It's Benjamin's father. He called him to the mansion this morning. I don't know what they talked about, but I can't shake the feeling that something's about to change. Her grandmother nodded thoughtfully. Change isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's exactly what we need, even when it's uncomfortable. I just want him to be happy, Grace said quietly. Even if that means stepping back and letting him have his family. Her grandmother's expression softened. Benjamin chose you, Grace. Don't forget that. You're part of his family now, whether William likes it or not. Grace smiled faintly, though doubt still lingered in her heart. That evening, Benjamin returned to the cottage with a look of determination. Grace met him at the porch, her heart racing as she tried to read his expression. What happened? She asked. Benjamin stepped closer, taking her hands in his. He's starting to come around. Grace blinked in surprise. What? He admitted he was wrong, Benjamin explained. About your dad, about you. He's not perfect, Grace, but I think he's trying to make amends. Grace searched his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. And do you believe him? I think he means it, Benjamin said, his tone steady. But it's going to take time. This isn't something he can fix overnight. Grace nodded, her heart swelling with both hope and caution. So, what do we do now? We keep moving forward, Benjamin said, a smile tugging at his lips. Together. Later that night, William found himself alone in the mansion's grand dining room. The table, long enough to seat 20, felt like an endless expanse of emptiness. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his solitude. A man surrounded by wealth, but devoid of connection. In his hand, he held the photograph of him and Robert again, as he stared at it. The words Grace had spoken to him echoed in his mind. Respect us, for our love, for who we are. It was a simple request, yet it felt monumental. For years, William had operated under the belief that love was secondary to ambition, that relationships were expendable in the pursuit of success. But now, he was beginning to see the cracks in that philosophy. He placed the photograph back on the table, resolving to take the first step toward rebuilding the bridges he had burned. Starting with Grace. The morning sun shone brightly over Ash Hollow, casting a golden glow on the Sterling estate, as if nature itself was attempting to soften the cold edges of its grandeur. William Sterling stood by the large windows of his study, sipping his black coffee. His thoughts were miles away, fixated on Grace Hayes and her quiet but powerful confrontation. He had spent his life controlling every narrative, yet this young woman had disrupted his carefully constructed world with a single truth. He turned back to his desk, where a fresh bouquet of flowers rested. A gesture uncharacteristic for a man as stoic as William, he intended to deliver them personally, a symbol of his first attempt to reconcile with Grace. Grace, meanwhile, was tending to her grandmother's chickens, when a sleek black car pulled up to the cottage. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as William stepped out, holding the bouquet in one hand and an air of uncertainty in the other. His tailored suit and polished shoes looked absurdly out of place against the rustic backdrop. Grace, he greeted, his voice measured but hesitant. Mr. Sterling, she replied, her surprise evident. He extended the bouquet toward her, his gaze unyielding. I wanted to apologize for everything. Grace hesitated, her hands still dusty from her work, before accepting the flowers. Thank you, she said cautiously, but words alone don't fix what's been done. William nodded, acknowledging her point. You're right. That's why I'd like to talk if you'll allow it. Grace studied him, searching for ulterior motives. Seeing none, she gestured toward the porch. All right, let's talk. They sat on the porch, the simplicity of the setting contrasting sharply with the tension between them. Grace's grandmother observed from the kitchen window, her watchful eyes ensuring William behaved. I'll be honest, William began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When Benjamin told me about you, I thought I had everything figured out. I assumed you were like so many others, people drawn to wealth and power, but I was wrong. Grace raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. I've had your father's name on my mind ever since you mentioned him, William admitted. I've spent the last week going through old files, letters, anything I could find. What I did to him. I can't undo it, but I regret it deeply. The rawness in his voice took Grace by surprise. She softened slightly, but kept her guard up. Regret doesn't change the past, Mr. Sterling. It doesn't bring my father back or undo the years my family struggled because of what you did. I know, William said quietly. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends. Not just for Robert, but for you. And Benjamin. Grace leaned back, crossing her arms. And what does Benjamin think of all this? William sighed, his gaze dropping momentarily. He told me that actions speak louder than words. That if I want to earn your respect, I need to start by respecting you. Grace's expression softened further, but she didn't let her walls fall completely. Respect isn't given freely, Mr. Sterling. It's earned. William nodded. I understand that now, and I'm willing to put in the work. When Benjamin arrived at the cottage later that day, he found Grace sitting on the porch, the bouquet from his father resting in a vase on the table beside her. She looked contemplative, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Hey, he called softly, stepping onto the porch. Grace looked up, a small smile breaking through her serious expression. Hey, he sat beside her, glancing at the flowers. Dad's attempt at an olive branch. Something like that, Grace said with a chuckle. He came by earlier, we talked. Benjamin's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You talked? How did it go? Grace shrugged. Better than I expected. He admitted he was wrong. He said he regrets what happened to my father and that he wants to make amends. Benjamin exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. That's more than I thought he was capable of. Me too, Grace admitted. But I told him words aren't enough. If he really wants to change, he'll have to prove it. Benjamin reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. And do you think he will? Grace looked down at their intertwined hands, her expression thoughtful. I don't know, but for your sake, I'm willing to give him a chance. That evening, William returned to the mansion feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. His conversation with Grace had gone better than he'd expected, but her words lingered. Respect isn't given freely, it's earned. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the study, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For years, he had lived by one principle: control. He controlled his business, his family, and his legacy with an iron grip. But now, for the first time, he felt that grip loosening, rip. The photograph of him and Robert Hayes sat on the desk, a silent reminder of the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. William raised his glass in a quiet toast. To second chances, he muttered, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. As the night deepened, William found himself staring out the window at the sprawling estate, wondering if he could ever truly mend the fractures he had caused, not just with Grace, but with Benjamin. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to try. The Sterling mansion was uncharacteristically quiet the next morning. William sat in the dining room, his usual newspaper untouched on the table. Instead, he was lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the ornate chandelier above. For decades, he had lived according to one unshakable rule. Sterling men did not back down. Yet for the first time, he was beginning to question if that rule had done more harm than good. He glanced at his phone. Scrolling through the calendar, A board meeting loomed on the horizon, and the whispers of discontent from his peers still echoed in his mind. The Sterling name had been built on dominance, power, and unyielding control. Now, the very foundation of that legacy felt fragile. His butler, Gregory, entered the room with a silver tray. "Your coffee, sir," Gregory said, setting the cup down gently. "Thank you," William murmured, picking up the steaming cup. He hesitated before speaking again. "Gregory, do you think I've been fair?" Gregory paused, startled by the question. It wasn't often that William sought anyone's opinion, let alone his staff's. "Fair, sir. With my family," William clarified, his voice quieter now. "Have I treated them fairly?" Gregory considered his response carefully. "You've always been firm, sir, but perhaps fairness is not something easily seen by those in the moment." William nodded slowly, his thoughts wandering back to Benjamin and Grace. "Fairness," he muttered under his breath, as if testing the word. At the Hayes cottage, Grace was walking along the edge of the garden when she spotted Benjamin's car pulling into the driveway. He stepped out, carrying a folder tucked under his arm and wearing a thoughtful expression. "What's that?" Grace asked as he approached. Benjamin held up the folder. "Something you need to see." They settled on the porch, the spring breeze rustling the trees around them. Benjamin opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. "My father gave me this. It's everything about the early days of Sterling Industries. Contracts, letters, meeting notes, everything." Grace frowned, flipping through the pages. "Why would he give this to you?" "He says it's his way of being transparent," Benjamin explained. "He wants to show he's serious about making amends for what he did to your father." Grace paused, her finger tracing the signature at the bottom of one contract. Robert Hayes, her father's name, once reduced to a distant memory, now felt alive again in the ink and paper before her. "Does he really mean it?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "I think he does," Benjamin replied, "but I also think he's scared. He knows he's losing his grip on the company, on me, on everything. This is his way of trying to hold on to what he can." Grace closed the folder and set it aside. "What do you think I should do?" Benjamin reached for her hand. "I think we give him the chance to prove himself. Not for him, but for us." Grace nodded, her resolve steadying. "All right, let's see what he's willing to do." Later that afternoon, William made his way to the boardroom. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with expectation. The board members sat around the long table, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension as William entered. "I've called this meeting," William began, his voice firm but measured, "to address the concerns that have been raised about Benjamin's engagement." The room stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. Gregory Monroe, always the boldest among them, leaned forward. "We appreciate your initiative, William. I assume this means you've taken steps to resolve the situation?" William's gaze swept over the room, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I have, and my decision is this. I fully support Benjamin and Grace." The room fell silent, the shock palpable. Gregory's mouth opened and closed as he tried to find the words. "You support them." "Yes," William said firmly. "Grace Hayes is a woman of integrity, and her values align with the future I want for this family, and for Sterling Industries. If any of you have doubts, you're welcome to voice them. But understand this, my son's choices are his own, and I will not stand in his way." The tension in the room was electric, but no one dared challenge William directly. After a long pause, Gregory cleared his throat. "If that's your position, William, we'll respect it." William nodded curtly. "Good. That will be all." As the board members filed out, William felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he had made a decision based on something other than strategy or control. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but not unwelcome. That evening, William invited Benjamin and Grace to the mansion. The three of them sat in the parlor, the atmosphere awkward but civil. William, uncharacteristically, poured tea for Grace himself, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "I've spoken with the board," William began, breaking the silence, "and I've made it clear that I fully support your engagement." Benjamin raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You did?" "I did," William confirmed, "and I've also decided to take a step back from the company. It's time for a new generation to lead, with new values. Grace looked at him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. What brought you to this decision, Mr. Sterling? William met her gaze, his expression softening. You did, and your father Robert was a good man, and I failed him. I don't want to make the same mistake twice. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Grace nodded slowly, her voice quiet but firm. Thank you. Benjamin reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. For the first time in weeks, hope began to blossom. As the evening drew to a close, William watched them leave the mansion together, their bond unshaken by the trials they had faced. He stood in the doorway long after they were gone, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in decades, William Sterling felt like he had made the right choice. The sun hung high over Ash Hollow, casting a warm glow across the small cottage where Grace and her grandmother lived. Inside, the cozy space was alive with activity. Swatches of fabric covered the dining table, alongside lists, notes, and the beginnings of what would become Grace's wedding dress. Her grandmother worked diligently with a needle and thread, humming softly as Grace leaned over a book of floral arrangements. I still can't believe this is happening, Grace murmured, more to herself than anyone else. A few months ago, I never imagined my life would change so much. Her grandmother looked up, her wise eyes filled with warmth. Life has a way of surprising us, child, and sometimes those surprises are exactly what we need. Grace smiled, though a flicker of nervousness lingered in her expression. It's not just the wedding, she admitted. It's everything. The Sterling name, the attention, the expectations. It's a lot. Her grandmother set down the fabric, taking Grace's hand in hers. Listen to me, Grace. This day is about you and Benjamin. Nothing else. The rest of the world can wait. You've earned this happiness, so don't let anyone take it from you. At the Sterling mansion, preparations of a very different kind were underway. Benjamin paced the grand ballroom, overseeing a team of planners who buzzed around, adjusting decorations and mapping out seating arrangements. The room was already beautiful, but Benjamin wanted it to be perfect for Grace. Make sure the flowers are fresh, he instructed one of the staff, glancing at the towering vases lining the walls. And the musicians? Have we confirmed their arrival time? Yes, sir, the planner replied, scribbling notes on her clipboard. Everything is on schedule. Benjamin nodded, but still felt the weight of the occasion pressing on him. For all the grandeur and beauty being assembled, he worried about the intangible forces at play, mainly the lingering doubts of the Sterling board and the scrutiny of the elite, as if sensing his thoughts. William entered the ballroom, his presence commanding as ever. How are things coming along? He asked, surveying the room. Good, Benjamin replied, though his tone was clipped. Just making sure everything's perfect for Grace. William nodded, his expression unusually thoughtful. You've done well. She'll appreciate the effort. Benjamin hesitated, then turned to his father. I'm not just doing this for her. I'm doing it because I want her to feel like she belongs here. She does, William said simply. More than most of the people who'll be attending. Benjamin blinked, surprised by his father's candidness. That's not what I expected you to say. William smirked faintly. I'm full of surprises these days. The moment of levity passed quickly, and William's tone grew serious. Benjamin, there's something I need to ask you about the company. What about it? Benjamin asked, his guard rising slightly. William crossed his arms, his gaze steady. I meant what I said about stepping back, but I need to know. Are you ready to lead? To take on everything that comes with it? Benjamin frowned, caught off guard by the question. This isn't exactly the time for a business discussion, Dad. It's not just business, William pressed. It's legacy. It's the future of this family. And if Grace is going to be part of that, I need to know you're ready to protect her from the pressures that come with it. Benjamin squared his shoulders, his voice firm. I'm ready, and I don't need your approval to love her or to build a life with her. William held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Good, because this family needs you to be stronger than I ever was. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final details and mounting excitement. Grace's grandmother finished the dress, a simple yet elegant design that reflected Grace's unpretentious nature at the same time. Benjamin finalized every element of the ceremony, ensuring it would honor both their love and the values they held dear. But as the date approached, Whispers began to resurface among the elite. "Can you believe it?" one woman murmured at a social club. "A Sterling marrying a farm girl. What's next? A Sterling running a soup kitchen." Others scoffed at the idea of Grace taking her place in the Sterling family, their disdain evident in their sneers and laughter. The gossip reached Grace eventually, carried by well-meaning acquaintances who didn't realize how deeply their words would cut. "I heard what they're saying about me," Grace admitted to Benjamin one evening as they sat together on the porch of her cottage. "That I don't belong. That I'll ruin your name." Benjamin's jaw tightened, his hand finding hers. "Grace, listen to me. Those people don't matter. They've spent their lives pretending to be better than everyone else because they're afraid of being seen for what they really are. Empty. But what if they're right?" Grace whispered, her voice wavering. "What if I don't belong in your world? You're not trying to fit into my world," Benjamin said gently. "We're building a new one, together." Grace looked at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I just want to make you proud." "You already do," he said, pulling her into a reassuring embrace. On the eve of the wedding, Grace stood in front of the mirror, wearing her completed dress for the first time. Her grandmother stood behind her, adjusting the veil with careful hands. "You look beautiful," her grandmother said, her voice full of pride. Grace smiled, her reflection shimmering with both nerves and excitement. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." The older woman squeezed her shoulders. "You deserve this happiness, Grace. Don't forget that." As Grace turned to face her, a soft knock came at the door. Benjamin stepped inside, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," he teased. "But I couldn't wait." Grace laughed softly, her nerves easing at his presence. "What do you think?" "I think," Benjamin said, stepping closer and taking her hands, "you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Their love filled the room, stronger than any doubt or criticism they had faced. Tomorrow, they would begin a new chapter, one that would defy every expectation and rewrite the rules of what it meant to be a Sterling. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed almost too good to be true. At the Sterling mansion, the grounds were transformed into an enchanting paradise. Rows of white chairs lined the sprawling lawn, leading to an altar draped with soft, flowing fabric and adorned with wildflowers that Grace had chosen herself. The scent of blooming roses filled the air, mingling with the faint notes of a string quartet tuning their instruments. Guests began arriving in droves, their chatter a mix of curiosity and veiled judgment. Among the attendees were the usual faces of high society, business magnates, political figures, and socialites, each dressed to impress and armed with opinions about the union they were about to witness. In a quiet room inside the mansion, Grace stood before a full-length mirror, her grandmother and a small team of stylists fussing over her dress and veil. The gown, simple yet elegant, hugged her figure perfectly, the delicate lace shimmering in the sunlight streaming through the window. "You look breathtaking," her grandmother said, stepping back to admire her. "Your father would have been so proud." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I wish he could be here. He is, in his own way," her grandmother reassured her, touching the small pendant Grace wore around her neck, a keepsake that had belonged to her father. "And he'd want you to focus on the happiness ahead." Grace nodded, her heart steadying. Today was about more than the challenges they'd faced. It was about love, hope, and new beginnings. Outside, Benjamin adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time, his nerves fraying as he waited at the altar. William stood beside him, a silent but steady presence. For once, the elder Sterling wasn't barking orders or scrutinizing every detail. Instead, he seemed contemplative, his usual sharp edges softened. "You're nervous," William observed, breaking the silence. Benjamin chuckled dryly. "Understatement of the year." William allowed a faint smile. "Good. It means this matters to you." "It does," Benjamin said firmly. "More than anything." William hesitated before speaking again. "You've chosen well, son, Grace. She reminds me of someone I used to know." Benjamin turned to him, surprised. "Who?" "Your mother," William admitted, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She had that same quiet strength, that unshakable sense of self. Don't let anyone take that from her, or from you." Benjamin's throat tightened, but he managed a small nod. "I won't." The music shifted, signaling the start of the procession. Guests quieted, their attention turning to the aisle as the bridesmaids began their walk. Benjamin straightened, his heart pounding in anticipation. And then, there she was. Grace appeared at the top of the aisle, her arm linked with her grandmother's. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as she began her walk, the sunlight catching the delicate lace of her gown and the soft curls of her hair. She was radiant, every step filled with quiet confidence. Benjamin's breath caught in his chest as their eyes met. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the whispers, not the doubts, not the expectations. It was just the two of them. As the ceremony unfolded, the air seemed to hum with emotion. Vows were exchanged, each word carrying the weight of their journey. Tears shimmered in Grace's eyes as Benjamin spoke, his voice steady but filled with raw honesty. "Grace," he said, his hands holding hers tightly, "you've shown me what love truly means. Not power, not wealth, just love, and I promise to spend the rest of my life earning the gift of your heart." Grace smiled through her tears, her voice soft but unwavering. "Benjamin, you've given me a home I never thought I'd find. With you, I've learned that love isn't about where we come from. It's about where we're going, and I choose to go with you, wherever that may be." The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and as Benjamin kissed Grace, the crowd erupted into applause. For a brief, shining moment, all the doubts and judgments faded away, replaced by the undeniable truth of their love. The reception was a grand affair, held under a canopy of twinkling lights on the mansion's sprawling lawn. Guests mingled, champagne flowed freely, and the atmosphere was one of cautious celebration. But amid the joy, an unexpected moment unfolded. As the evening wore on, Grace approached William, who was standing off to the side, observing the festivities with a rare, contemplative expression. She held an envelope in her hand, her steps purposeful. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, drawing his attention. "Grace," he replied, his tone unusually gentle. "Shouldn't you be enjoying your party?" "I am," she said, smiling faintly, "but I wanted to give you something." She handed him the envelope, her gaze steady. "It's a letter my father wrote before he passed. My grandmother kept it all these years, and she thought you should have it." William's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the envelope. The paper inside was old but carefully preserved, the handwriting unmistakably Robert's. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words. "William, if you're reading this, I hope it means you've found a way to heal. Life is too short for regret, and too precious to waste on pride. The true legacy we leave isn't in wealth or power. It's in the love we pass to the next generation. Take care of them, William. They're all that matters. Robert." William's chest tightened as he read the words. The weight of them settled over him like a mantle, their truth undeniable. He looked up at Grace, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Grace nodded, her own eyes glistening. "It's time to let go of the past. Mr. Sterling, for all of us." William looked across the lawn to where Benjamin was laughing with friends, his arm around Grace's grandmother. For the first time in years, William felt something unfamiliar. Peace. As the night deepened and the lights sparkled above, the Sterling family began to heal. Not through power or legacy, but through love. The stars sparkled brightly over Ash Hollow as the wedding reception continued into the night. Laughter and music filled the air, and the clinking of glasses punctuated the joyous atmosphere. Yet, for William Sterling, the festivities blurred into the background as he stood in the quiet of the mansion's study, holding Robert Hayes's letter in his hands. The words written by his former partner weighed heavily on his heart. The true legacy we leave isn't in wealth or power. It's in the love we pass to the next generation. He had spent his entire life building an empire, believing it to be his greatest achievement. But now, in the wake of his son's wedding, and the sincerity of Grace's gesture, he began to question everything. For years, he had hidden behind his stoic facade, convinced that control and success were the only measures of a man's worth. But the letter, with its quiet wisdom, cut through those defenses. It wasn't too late to make a change, not for himself, but for Benjamin, Grace, and the future of the family he had worked so hard to protect. Meanwhile, out on the dance floor, Grace swayed in Benjamin's arms, her head resting against his chest. The soft melody of the string quartet surrounded them, creating a bubble of serenity amid the bustling celebration. "Did you give him the letter?" Benjamin asked softly, his lips brushing against her hair. Grace nodded, tilting her head to look up at him. "I did. I think it meant a lot to him." Benjamin sighed, a mix of relief and uncertainty in his expression. "Do you think he'll change?" "I hope so," Grace said. "But even if he doesn't, we have each other. That's enough for me." Benjamin smiled, pulling her closer. "You're my world, Grace. Everything else is just noise." As they danced, the guests watched with varying degrees of admiration and surprise. The sight of a sterling heir so openly devoted to his wife was unexpected, a stark contrast to the detached and transactional relationships that often define their circles. In the early hours of the morning, as the party wound down and the last of the guests began to leave, William emerged from his study. He found Benjamin and Grace seated on a bench beneath the glowing lanterns, sharing a quiet moment together. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of how to approach them. Then, summoning his courage, he stepped forward. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice unusually tentative. Benjamin and Grace looked up in surprise. Benjamin nodded, motioning for his father to sit. "Of course." William settled onto the bench, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. After a moment, he cleared his throat and turned to Grace. "I want to thank you," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "for the letter, and for the reminder of what truly matters." Grace smiled gently. "It wasn't just for you, Mr. Sterling. It was for all of us." William nodded, his gaze distant. "I've spent my life chasing something I thought was important. Power, wealth, control. But in the end, those things don't hold meaning. Not the way family does." Benjamin looked at his father, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "What are you saying, Dad?" "I'm saying," William continued, meeting his son's gaze, "that I'm ready to let go of the past, to focus on the future. Not just for the company, but for this family." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. For the first time, William's sincerity was clear, unclouded by the arrogance that had once defined him. In the days that followed, William's actions began to reflect his newfound resolve. He called an emergency meeting with the Sterling Industries Board, addressing them with a candor they had never seen. "I've decided to step down as CEO," he announced, his tone calm but firm. "It's time for new leadership that values not just profit, but integrity and compassion." The room erupted into murmurs, the board members exchanging shocked glances. Gregory Monroe, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak. "And who do you propose to take your place?" "Benjamin," William said without hesitation, with Grace at his side. Gregory frowned. "With all due respect, William, the boy has potential, but he's untested. And Grace, she's a force to be reckoned with," William interrupted, his voice cutting through the room. "She's already shown more resilience and wisdom than most of us combined. If anyone can guide this company into the future, it's them." The board reluctantly agreed, swayed more by William's determination than by their own convictions. As the meeting adjourned, William felt a sense of closure, knowing he had made the right decision. At the cottage, Grace and Benjamin were still adjusting to their new reality. The news of William's decision had shocked them both, but it also filled them with a sense of responsibility. "What do you think this means for us?" Grace asked one evening as they sat together on the porch. "It means we have a chance to do things differently," Benjamin replied, his hand resting on hers. "To build something that reflects who we are, not just who people expect us to be." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I think your father is finally starting to understand that." Benjamin nodded, a rare glint of admiration in his eyes. "He is, and it's because of you." As the night deepened, the couple sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey behind them, and the promise of a new future ahead. For the first time in their lives, they felt truly free to love, to lead, and to create a legacy that would honor not just their family name, but the values they held most dear. The following weeks marked a profound shift in the Sterling household. The mansion, once an imposing symbol of power and control, began to transform into something warmer and more welcoming. William Sterling, the man who had once ruled his family and company with an iron fist, was now a quieter presence, the change didn't go unnoticed. Grace and Benjamin were adjusting to their new roles as leaders of Sterling Industries. While Benjamin managed the operational side, Grace took a personal approach, meeting employees and understanding the inner workings of the company. Her authenticity and humility quickly won over even the most skeptical staff members. One afternoon, as Grace walked through the factory floor, she paused to speak with a group of workers taking a break. "How long have you been with the company?" she asked a middle-aged man named Carlos, who looked surprised that she was addressing him directly. 15 years, ma'am," he replied, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "And in those 15 years, have you ever spoken to someone from management like this?" Grace asked with a smile. Carlos shook his head, chuckling nervously. "Can't say I have." "Well," Grace said warmly, "I hope that changes. If there's anything you or your team need, don't hesitate to let me know. This company isn't just about profits. It's about people." As Grace moved on, Carlos turned to his co-workers, shaking his head in disbelief. "She's different," he muttered. "This place might actually change." Meanwhile, William was busy fulfilling his promise to step back and focus on family. He spent more time at the cottage, often sharing quiet conversations with Grace's grandmother. The two had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their mutual concern for the couple's future. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, William sat with Grace's grandmother on the porch, a cup of tea in his hands. He seemed lost in thought. "You've been awfully quiet today," the older woman remarked, her sharp eyes studying him. "What's on your mind?" William sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I'm just reflecting on how much I've lost, and how much I still have to make up for." Her expression softened. "You've taken the first step, William. That's more than most men in your position would do." "Is it enough?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "Can I ever truly make amends for what I've done?" "That's not for me to decide," she replied. "But I can tell you this. Grace and Benjamin see the effort you're making. And sometimes, effort is what matters most." William nodded, her words resonating deeply. For years, he had equated success with perfection, but now he was beginning to see that vulnerability and effort carried their own kind of strength. At Sterling Industries, the changes implemented by Grace and Benjamin began to take root. The couple introduced initiatives focused on employee well-being, environmental sustainability, and community outreach. Grace spearheaded a scholarship program in honor of her father, providing educational opportunities for the children of Sterling employees during a press conference announcing the program. A reporter asked Benjamin a pointed question. "Mr. Sterling, do you think your wife's background has influenced the direction of the company?" Benjamin smiled, glancing at Grace, who stood beside him. "Absolutely," he said. "Grace has shown me, and everyone else, that true strength comes from compassion. Her background isn't a disadvantage. It's an asset, and I couldn't be prouder to have her by my side." Grace's cheeks flushed as the room erupted into applause. The moment marked a turning point in public perception. For the first time, the Sterling name was associated with more than just wealth. It was a symbol of integrity and progress. Back at the mansion, William watched the press conference on a large screen in the study. His chest swelled with pride as he listened to Benjamin's words. The son he had once doubted was now a man he deeply respected. And Grace, the woman he had tried to dismiss, had become the heart of the family. As the applause faded on the screen, William reached for his phone and dialed Benjamin. "You spoke well," he said. When his son answered, "Thanks, Dad," Benjamin replied, his tone light but appreciative. It felt good to finally put something out there that matters. "It did more than that," William said. "It showed everyone what this family stands for now." "You've made me proud, son." There was a pause on the other end before Benjamin spoke again. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." When the call ended, William sat back in his chair, a rare smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. That evening, Grace and Benjamin joined William at the mansion for dinner. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and stories of their recent successes. As the meal wound down, William raised his glass, clearing his throat. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "to Grace and Benjamin, for reminding me what truly matters in life, love, integrity, and the courage to build something meaningful. You've not only changed this family, but you've changed me." Grace's eyes glistened with tears as she raised her glass. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." "William," he corrected gently, a rare warmth in his tone. "You can call me William," Benjamin chuckled, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." As the glasses clinked, a sense of unity settled over the table. The Sterling family, once fractured by pride and ambition, was finally healing. Together, they were ready to embrace the future, one built on a foundation of love, respect, and redemption. The morning sunlight spilled across the expansive Sterling Industries headquarters, casting long shadows on the polished marble floors. Inside the executive conference room, Benjamin sat at the head of the table, Grace by his side. Across from them, the board members exchanged uneasy glances, while the recent initiatives introduced by the couple had garnered public acclaim. Not everyone within the company shared the same enthusiasm. Gregory Monroe, the oldest and most traditional member of the board, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling, while we respect your intentions, these new programs, scholarships, community outreach, environmental reforms, they're bleeding money. Shareholders are concerned." Benjamin leaned forward, his voice steady. "We've seen an increase in employee satisfaction, retention, and public support since implementing these changes. In the long term, these investments will pay off." "And what about now?" Gregory pressed. "The numbers don't lie, Benjamin. This isn't how Sterling Industries was built," Grace interjected, her tone calm but firm. "No, it's not. But maybe it's time we think about the future differently. Sterling Industries doesn't have to be just a symbol of power and profit. It can be a force for good." The room fell silent as her words settled. Gregory pursed his lips but said nothing further. Benjamin reached for Grace's hand under the table, grateful for her composure. Though they had expected resistance, the weight of pushing against decades of tradition was heavier than they'd imagined. Later that afternoon, Benjamin and Grace retreated to a quiet corner of the company's rooftop garden, a space Grace had insisted on revitalizing for employees. The soft hum of city life surrounded them as they sat on a bench, overlooking the skyline. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," Benjamin said, running a hand through his hair. "But sometimes it feels like we're trying to move a mountain." Grace smiled faintly, resting her head on his shoulder. "You can't change people overnight. It takes time, but every step we take matters, even the small ones." Benjamin sighed, wrapping an arm around her. "I just want to make this work. For us, for the company, for everyone depending on us. And you will," Grace said softly. "We will." Meanwhile, at the mansion, William observed the couple's progress from a distance. Though he had stepped back from daily operations, he couldn't entirely disengage from the empire he had spent decades building. He read every report, followed every press release, and occasionally visited the headquarters to offer quiet advice. On one such visit, William stood at the edge of the bustling factory floor, watching employees move with a newfound sense of purpose. A younger man, one of the supervisors, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, slightly out of breath. "It's an honor to meet you." William turned, offering a rare smile. "Thank you, and you are?" "Luis Rivera," the man said, extending a hand. "I've been with the company for 5 years. I just wanted to say, the changes your son and Grace are making, they're good for all of us." William nodded, surprised by the sincerity in the man's voice. "I'm glad to hear that, Luis. It seems they're doing something right." Luis smiled. "More than right. They've given us a reason to care again." As Luis returned to his work, William stood quietly, his thoughts churning. Perhaps the legacy he had so fiercely protected was finally in good hands. The weeks that followed brought both triumphs and setbacks. A new partnership with a local nonprofit garnered praise from the media. While a dip in quarterly earnings gave fuel to critics like Gregory Monroe, the pressure mounted. But Benjamin and Grace pressed on, bolstered by the growing support of employees and the community. One evening, as they reviewed documents at the dining room table in the cottage, Benjamin looked up, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "Do you ever feel like we're fighting a battle we can't win?" Grace reached across the table, taking his hand. "We're not fighting to win, Ben. We're fighting to make a difference, and that's worth it." Her words steadied him, reminding him of why they had embarked on this journey together. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, his voice soft. "You'll never have to find out," she replied. squeezing his hand. At the next board meeting, Benjamin came prepared. He stood before the group, presenting data that highlighted the long-term benefits of their initiatives: increased employee retention, improved public perception, and a growing market share in socially conscious demographics. "We're not just a business," Benjamin concluded, his voice strong. "We're a community, and if we want to thrive in the future, we have to adapt. Sterling Industries will lead, not just in profits but in purpose." Grace watched him with pride, her confidence in him unwavering. The room was silent for a moment, before one of the younger board members spoke up. "He's right," she said, glancing around the table. "The world is changing. If we don't change with it, we'll be left behind." One by one, others began to nod in agreement. Even Gregory Monroe, though reluctant, offered a begrudging nod. For the first time, it felt as though the tide was turning in their favor. That evening, Benjamin and Grace returned to the mansion for dinner with William. As they recounted the day's events, William listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Better than I ever could have." Benjamin looked at his father, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Coming from you, that means a lot." William smiled faintly, raising his glass. "To progress, and to the two of you, for showing me what this family is capable of." Grace and Benjamin clinked their glasses with his, the moment heavy with meaning. Though the challenges they faced were far from over, they knew they had the strength to face them together. The Sterling legacy was changing, no longer defined by power and ambition, but by the love and integrity that now bound them as a family. The cool autumn breeze swept through Ash Hollow as Sterling Industries buzzed with activity. Inside the headquarters, Benjamin and Grace stood in the heart of the company's bustling office floor. They were preparing to launch the latest initiative in their ongoing effort to reshape the company, a profit-sharing program for employees. "This is it," Benjamin said, holding a folder filled with the program's details. "If this works, it could redefine how we do business." Grace smiled, her confidence unwavering. "It will work. People will see that we value them, not just for what they contribute to the company, but for who they are." As they made their way to the conference room for the announcement, employees gathered, their curiosity evident. Benjamin took his place at the podium, with Grace standing beside him. The room quieted as he began to speak. "When my wife and I took over Sterling Industries," Benjamin began, his voice clear and steady, "we made a promise to ourselves and to all of you, to build a company that values its people as much as its profits. Today, we're taking another step toward fulfilling that promise." He paused, scanning the room, his words resonating with the attentive crowd. "Starting this quarter, we're implementing a profit-sharing program. A portion of our earnings will be distributed among all employees, not just executives, but everyone, because this company's success is your success." The announcement was met with stunned silence, followed by a wave of applause. Employees exchanged excited whispers, their faces lighting up with hope. Grace stepped forward, adding her own message. "This isn't just about money," she said warmly. It's about building a community where everyone feels valued and supported. Together, we can create something truly extraordinary." The room erupted into cheers, and for the first time, Sterling Industries felt less like a corporate giant and more like a family. As the program rolled out, the impact was immediate. Employees reported feeling more motivated and appreciated, and productivity increased across departments. News of the initiative spread, earning praise from business leaders and media outlets alike. Even longtime critics of the company began to take notice. Gregory Monroe, once the most vocal opponent of Benjamin and Grace's reforms, approached them in the boardroom one afternoon. His usual stern demeanor had softened, replaced by a hint of respect. "I'll admit," Gregory began, clearing his throat, "I had my doubts about your methods, but the numbers don't lie. You've proven me wrong." Benjamin raised an eyebrow, his surprise evident. "Does this mean you're on board now?" Gregory smirked. "Let's just say I'm willing to see where this goes." It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was progress. Grace exchanged a knowing glance with Benjamin, their shared determination carrying them forward. At home, William observed the transformation from a distance. his pride in his son and daughter-in-law growing with each passing day. He had never imagined that the legacy he built would evolve in such a way, but he couldn't deny the positive impact their changes had made. One evening, as he sat with Grace and Benjamin in the mansion's cozy library, he broached a topic that had been weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking about the company," William began, swirling a glass of brandy in his hand. "And about what comes next." Benjamin leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your mother and I founded Sterling Industries with one vision in mind," William explained. "But the two of you have created something far greater than I ever could have imagined. It's time for me to put my faith fully in your hands." Grace's eyes widened. "William, you've already stepped back. What more could you possibly do?" "I want to make it official," William said firmly. "The company is yours now. Entirely. No strings attached. No conditions. It's time for me to let go." Benjamin and Grace exchanged stunned glances. The weight of his words wasn't lost on them. For William Sterling to relinquish control entirely was a monumental step. "Thank you, Dad," Benjamin said, his voice filled with emotion. "We won't let you down." "I know you won't," William replied with a faint smile. "You've already proven that." The next day, the transition was finalized. William's official resignation as chairman of the board was announced, with Benjamin taking his place and Grace stepping into a prominent leadership role. The news was met with mixed reactions, but the couple's track record spoke for itself. Under their guidance, Sterling Industries began to redefine its image in the business world. The company's success was no longer measured solely in financial terms, but in the positive impact it had on its employees and the community. Grace's scholarship program flourished, helping dozens of families access educational opportunities they never thought possible. Benjamin's profit-sharing initiative became a model for other companies to follow. Together, they had transformed Sterling Industries into a symbol of hope and progress. One evening, as Grace and Benjamin walked hand in hand through the cottage garden, they reflected on how far they had come. "I never imagined this is where we'd end up," Grace said, her voice filled with wonder. "It feels like a dream." "It's a dream we built together," Benjamin replied, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "And we're just getting started." Grace smiled, her heart full. "Do you think your father ever expected any of this?" Benjamin chuckled. "Not in a million years. But I think he's proud." As they stood under the stars, their journey felt complete, yet full of promise. They had faced challenges and overcome doubts, proving that love, integrity, and determination could triumph over even the toughest obstacles. Their legacy was no longer just about wealth or power. It was about people, progress, and the bond that had brought them together. The crisp air of early winter filled Ash Hollow, carrying with it a sense of renewal and hope. Sterling Industries was thriving under Benjamin and Grace's leadership, and their bold initiatives had become a blueprint for other companies looking to merge profitability with purpose. At the mansion, William Sterling observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, no longer burdened by the pressures of leadership. He had taken to spending his days at the cottage with Grace's grandmother, indulging in long conversations over tea, and rediscovering a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. One morning, as he walked through the fields near the cottage, William saw Grace planting new flowers in the garden. He approached her with a small smile, his polished shoes incongruous against the rich soil. "Good morning," he greeted, crouching slightly to get a better look at her work. "Hard at it." "As always." Grace looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning, William. Just trying to bring a little more color to the world." He chuckled, a rare sound that still surprised even himself. "You've certainly done that. More than anyone else I know." Grace set down her tools, dusting off her hands as she rose to face him. "And what about you? How does retirement feel?" William's smile turned wistful. "Strange at times, but freeing in a way. Watching you and Benjamin take the reins has been humbling and inspiring." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "You've changed." "William, you're not the same man I met that day in your study. That man," William said with a small shake of his head, "was a fool, blind to what truly mattered. If not for you, I might have stayed that way." Grace smiled softly. "Sometimes, we all need someone to show us a different perspective." Back at Sterling Industries, Benjamin was wrapping up a meeting with the company's management team. The energy in the room was vibrant, a stark contrast to the rigid and formal atmosphere that had once dominated the boardroom. "Let's prioritize the mentorship program next quarter," Benjamin said, closing his notebook. "Grace and I want every employee to feel supported, especially those just starting their careers." The team nodded enthusiastically, and as the meeting ended, Benjamin lingered, watching as his colleagues filed out. His mind drifted to the path that had brought him here, the sacrifices, the resistance, and the unwavering love that had made it all possible. As he left the office and made his way home, Benjamin felt a deep sense of gratitude. Grace's influence had not only shaped the company, but had also transformed him into the man he had always wanted to be. That evening, the Sterling Mansion hosted a modest celebration. The occasion, the official launch of a new initiative, the Hayes Foundation, named in honor of Grace's late father, Robert. The foundation's mission was to support underprivileged families and foster the kind of opportunities Robert had once dreamed of providing. The ballroom, once a symbol of exclusivity and power, now teemed with people from all walks of life. Employees, community members, and even former critics of the Sterlings mingled, united by a shared sense of purpose. Grace stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her demeanor warm and welcoming. Beside her, Benjamin beamed with pride, his hand resting gently on her back. When William entered the room, the chatter hushed briefly, as if his presence still commanded an air of reverence. But instead of the imperious man he once was, he carried himself with humility, exchanging genuine smiles and handshakes as he moved through the crowd. Later in the evening, as the guests settled in, Benjamin took to the stage. The room quieted as he adjusted the microphone, his voice steady and full of emotion. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just the launch of the Hayes Foundation," he began. "We celebrate the values that brought us here. Compassion, integrity, and the belief that true success is measured by the lives we touch." He paused, glancing at Grace, who smiled up at him. "This foundation is a tribute to a man I never had the chance to meet, but whose legacy lives on in the incredible woman I'm lucky enough to call my wife, Grace. This wouldn't be possible without you." The room erupted into applause as Grace joined Benjamin on stage. She took the microphone, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Thank you," she began. "This foundation isn't just about my father. It's about every family that has struggled, every dream that's been deferred, and every person who's believed they could make a difference. Together, we can create a world where those dreams are possible." As the applause swelled, William watched from the sidelines, his chest tightening with pride. For the first time in years, he felt like the Sterling name truly stood for something worthwhile. Later, as the celebration wound down, Grace and Benjamin stepped outside to catch their breath. The cool night air wrapped around them, and the stars above seemed brighter than ever. "We did it," Grace said softly, leaning into Benjamin's side. "No," Benjamin corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You did it. You've changed everything. For me, for my family, for this company." Grace looked up at him, her eyes shining. "We did it together, and this is just the beginning." As they stood there, hand in hand, the future stretched out before them, bright, boundless, and filled with possibility. Months passed, and the changes at Sterling Industries continued to ripple through Ash Hollow and beyond. The Hayes Foundation gained national recognition for its innovative programs, and Sterling Industries itself became a symbol of corporate responsibility. For Grace and Benjamin, the success of their endeavors was not just professional, it was deeply personal. On a bright spring morning, the couple stood on the porch of the cottage, looking out over the freshly tilled fields. Benjamin's arm was draped around Grace, who was holding a steaming cup of tea. "This feels right," Benjamin said, his voice soft. "Everything we've worked for, everything we've built, it feels like it's finally paying off." Grace smiled, leaning into him. "It's not about the payoff, Ben. It's about the journey. And ours has been unexpected, but beautiful," he chuckled, kissing the top of her head. "Beautiful doesn't even begin to describe it." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. William stepped out, dressed casually in a way that was becoming increasingly common for him. He carried a thick envelope in his hand, and a look of quiet determination on his face. "Morning, you two," he greeted, climbing the porch steps. "Morning, Dad," Benjamin replied, gesturing to the rocking chair beside them. "What brings you out here so early?" William sat down, holding the envelope in his lap. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his tone serious. "About the future and the past." Grace and Benjamin exchanged curious glances. "Go on," Grace encouraged gently. William exhaled deeply, running a hand over the envelope. "For most of my life, I thought legacy meant power, wealth, and control. I was wrong. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you give to others while you're here. And the two of you have shown me what that really means." He handed the envelope to Benjamin. "This is for the Hayes Foundation. It's a gift, a way to honor Robert and to ensure the work you're doing continues for generations." Benjamin opened the envelope, his eyes widening as he saw the contents. It was a transfer of shares, significant enough to provide the foundation with financial security for years to come. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "William," she began, her voice trembling. "This is incredible, thank you." William nodded, his own emotions threatening to surface. "Don't thank me. This is what I should have done years ago. You've earned it, both of you." Benjamin stood, pulling his father into a rare embrace. "We couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. William shook his head. "Look, no, son. You did this because you're better than I ever was. And for that, I couldn't be prouder." That evening, the Sterling family gathered at the mansion for a private dinner. Grace's grandmother joined them, her sharp wit and warm presence filling the room with laughter. For the first time, the house felt like a home, not a fortress as dessert was served. William stood, raising his glass. "To family," he said, his voice strong but filled with emotion, "and to the legacy we create together, not through wealth, but through love, integrity, and the lives we touch." The toast was met with heartfelt clinks of glasses and murmurs of agreement. Grace's grandmother wiped a tear from her eye, smiling at the man she had once regarded with suspicion. "Not bad, William," she teased. "Not bad at all." The following weeks brought a sense of stability and fulfillment to their lives. Grace and Benjamin continued to balance their roles at Sterling Industries and the Hayes Foundation. Their partnership stronger than ever, William found joy in mentoring younger generations, sharing the lessons he had learned the hard way. One afternoon, as Grace walked through the community garden she had helped establish, she paused to watch a group of children planting seeds. Their laughter filled the air, a reminder of the hope that had driven her journey from the start. Benjamin joined her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She smiled, her gaze never leaving the children. "That this is what it's all about, building something that lasts. Not for ourselves, but for them." Benjamin kissed her temple, his own heart full. "We've done well, haven't we?" "We have," Grace agreed, her voice soft but resolute. "And the best part, we're just getting started." As the sun set over Ash Hollow, the Sterling family stood on the mansion's balcony, watching the horizon bathe the land in hues of gold and orange. They had faced challenges and doubts, endured heartbreak and loss, but together, they had emerged stronger. Their legacy was no longer one of ambition and control. It was a legacy of love, compassion, and the courage to change, a testament to the belief that true strength lies not in wealth, but in the connections we forge and the lives we uplift. And for the Sterlings, that was a legacy worth building.